Some animals don't forget the people who abandoned them, but what this gorilla did after 12 years left an entire sanctuary frozen in shock. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The screaming started before Emily Carter even stepped out of the Jeep. Somewhere beyond the steel gates of the sanctuary, a deep roar thundered through the humid morning air, rattling the nearby fences hard enough to make several birds burst from the trees. Emily froze instantly. Even after all these years, she recognized that sound. "That's Koba," she whispered under her breath, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. Standing beside her, head zookeeper Daniel Brooks looked uneasy. He adjusted the radio clip to his belt and stared toward the massive enclosure hidden behind rows of thick jungle foliage. "You still have time to change your mind," he said carefully. "Once he sees you, there's no telling how he'll react." Emily didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the enclosure entrance nearly 100 yards away. 12 years. 12 long years since she had last seen the gorilla she once raised like family. 12 years since she had bottle-fed him, slept beside him during storms, and carried him wrapped in blankets after poachers killed his mother deep in the Congo rainforest. Back then, Koba had been small enough to fit against her chest. Now he weighed nearly 500 pounds and was considered one of the most unpredictable silverbacks in captivity. Another roar exploded through the sanctuary. Louder this time. Closer. Several nearby tourists turned nervously toward the trees while a pair of security guards hurried past carrying tranquilizer rifles. Emily's stomach tightened. "What happened?" she finally asked. Daniel hesitated before speaking. 3 months ago, Koba injured part of the enclosure during a panic episode. Since then, he hasn't trusted anyone. He barely eats, barely sleeps. Sophie thinks he's suffering from severe emotional distress. Emily looked down for a moment, guilt washing across her face. "And you think seeing me could make it worse?" Daniel sighed heavily. "Honestly, I don't know. But this morning one of the keepers accidentally played an old recording from the nursery archives." He paused. "Your voice." Emily's eyes widened. "What happened?" Before Daniel could answer, another terrifying roar shook the air. This time it was followed by shouting. Radios crackled frantically nearby. Somewhere ahead, metal slammed violently against metal. Daniel immediately grabbed Emily's arm. "Stay behind me." The 2 security guards sprinted toward the enclosure entrance, while sanctuary staff rushed out of nearby buildings in panic. Then suddenly, everything went quiet. Completely quiet. No birds. No voices. Nothing. Daniel slowly removed his hand from Emily's arm and stared toward the enclosure with visible tension in his face. "That's the part that scares me most," he muttered. Emily could now hear her own heartbeat. She swallowed hard as they walked deeper into the sanctuary, following the narrow dirt trail toward Koba's habitat. Every memory she had spent years trying to bury came flooding back stronger with every step. Koba chasing butterflies through the grass. Koba sleeping beside her cabin fireplace during thunderstorms. Koba reaching for her hand whenever strangers came too close. He had trusted her completely once. But people changed. Animals changed too. And somewhere deep inside her chest, a terrible question had started growing louder with every passing second. What if Koba remembered being left behind? The final security gate buzzed open slowly. Beyond it stood a reinforced wall of thick glass nearly 20 feet high. Several nervous staff members were gathered behind it, staring into the enclosure with pale faces. Emily stepped forward carefully, her breathing shallow. At first she didn't see him. Then the trees moved. A gigantic black figure slowly emerged from the shadows. Koba, older now, massive, scars visible across his shoulders. His dark eyes scanned the area once, twice, before suddenly locking directly onto Emily. And the second he recognized her, the silverback stood upright and charged straight toward the glass. The enormous silverback slammed both hands against the glass with a sound so powerful that several staff members stumbled backward in fear. Emily flinched instinctively as the reinforced barrier trembled inches from her face. Koba towered over everyone around him, his massive chest rising and falling rapidly while his dark eyes remained locked entirely on her. No one else in the sanctuary seemed to exist. Back away from the glass, one of the guards warned nervously, gripping his tranquilizer rifle tighter. But Emily could not move. Not because she was fearless, because something about Koba's expression felt wrong. This was not rage. It was something deeper, something desperate. Koba let out another roar, but this time it sounded different. Less aggressive, more strained, almost like frustration. He began pacing along the glass, moving back and forth with restless energy while never taking his eyes off Emily for even a second. Daniel stepped closer beside her. "This is already more intense than we expected," he whispered. Usually he avoids people completely. Emily slowly raised a trembling hand toward the glass. The moment she did, Koba froze. The giant gorilla stared at her hand in complete silence. Then something changed in his face. The tension around his eyes softened slightly, and for a brief second Emily saw it. The same look he used to give her as a baby whenever he was frightened during thunderstorms. A memory hit her instantly. 12 years earlier, during one of the worst storms the sanctuary had ever seen, young Koba had hidden beneath her bed shaking in terror while lightning crashed outside the cabin windows. Emily had spent hours sitting on the floor beside him, softly humming until he finally fell asleep with his tiny hand wrapped around her wrist. Back then, Koba had trusted her more than anyone in the world. "Emily," Daniel said carefully, pulling her back to the present. "You should know something else." She looked at him without taking her eyes off Koba. "What?" Daniel hesitated. "After you left, Koba changed slowly at first. He stopped interacting with the other gorillas. Then he became withdrawn from the staff too. About 5 years ago, he started carrying objects into the far corner of the enclosure and hiding them." Emily frowned slightly. "What kind of objects?" Daniel exchanged a nervous glance with Sophie, the sanctuary veterinarian standing nearby. "Things connected to you," Sophie answered quietly. Emily stared at her in disbelief. "That is impossible." "We thought so too," Sophie admitted. "Until we checked the security footage." Koba suddenly let out a low rumbling sound deep in his throat. Emily looked back toward the glass and noticed him crouching lower now, his enormous hands resting against the concrete floor while his eyes studied her face intensely. It almost looked as if he was searching for confirmation that she was real. "He kept an old green blanket for years," Sophie continued softly. "No one knew where he found it. Every time staff tried removing it, he became extremely distressed." Emily's heart skipped. She remembered the blanket instantly. It had belonged to her during her early years at the sanctuary. Koba used to sleep wrapped inside it whenever he got cold at night. Daniel lowered his voice further. "Last year during renovations, one of the keepers discovered something hidden beneath the rocks in the enclosure." Emily slowly turned toward him again. "What?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Photographs." Emily's face drained of color. "Photographs of who?" Before Daniel could answer, Koba suddenly rose to his full height again. The silverback pressed one massive hand flat against the glass directly in front of Emily. The sanctuary fell silent around them. Slowly, almost unable to breathe, Emily lifted her own hand toward the barrier. Their hands aligned perfectly through the thick glass. And then everyone watching noticed something that made even the security guards lower their weapons in confusion. Koba was trembling. No one behind the glass could understand why a 500-pound silverback that terrified every handler in the sanctuary suddenly looked like a frightened child. Koba kept his massive hand pressed against the barrier while his body shook visibly from head to toe. Emily stared at him in disbelief, her own breathing becoming uneven as memories she had spent years trying to bury returned all at once. "He never does this," Sophie whispered softly beside Daniel. "Not with anyone." Koba lowered his head slightly, his dark eyes never leaving Emily's face. Then he made a sound that instantly sent chills through the entire room. It was not a roar, not a growl. It was a low, broken whimper. Emily covered her mouth with one hand, stunned. She had not heard that sound in over a decade. Koba used to make that exact noise whenever he was scared as a baby. Daniel slowly lowered his radio. Around them, even the security guards looked uncertain now. The terrifying animal they had all feared moments earlier no longer seemed dangerous. He seemed emotional, confused, almost overwhelmed. "Emily," Daniel said carefully, "there is something you need to see." He motioned toward a nearby security office overlooking the enclosure. Emily hesitated before finally stepping away from the glass. The second she moved, Koba suddenly became restless again. He followed her movement instantly, pacing along the barrier with anxious energy while letting out deep rumbling sounds from his chest. Emily stopped walking. Koba stopped too. "Oh my God," Sophie whispered under her breath. Daniel opened the office door quickly and guided Emily inside, while several staff members crowded around a computer monitor. One young keeper inserted a flash drive and pulled up security footage from 3 months earlier. The grainy black and white video showed Koba late at night sitting alone in the far corner of his enclosure during heavy rain. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then the giant gorilla slowly reached beneath a pile of rocks and carefully pulled out a small metal box. Emily frowned. "What is that?" "Watch," Daniel said quietly. Koba opened the box with surprising gentleness. Inside were dozens of objects wrapped carefully in old cloth. The staff fast-forwarded the footage as Koba examined each item one by one beneath the rain. Emily suddenly leaned closer to the screen. "Wait." Her voice cracked slightly. "Pause it." The keeper froze the footage instantly. Inside Koba's enormous hand was a faded friendship bracelet made from blue and yellow thread. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "That cannot be possible," she whispered. "I made that when he was little." Sophie nodded slowly. There was more. The footage resumed. One by one, Koba removed old photographs, pieces of fabric, and even a weathered cassette tape from the metal box. Every item belonged to Emily. Every single one. "He hid them for years," Daniel explained softly. "No one knew where they came from because he became extremely aggressive anytime staff went near that corner." Emily stared silently at the screen as Koba carefully pressed one of the photographs against his chest. Her eyes began filling with tears. "He remembered me all this time," she whispered. Daniel looked uneasy. "That is what scares us." Emily turned toward him in confusion. "What do you mean?" Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly before answering. "After hearing your voice this morning, Koba stopped eating completely. He ignored every handler. Then he sat by the main gate for nearly 6 hours." Emily's heart sank. "Waiting?" Daniel nodded grimly. "Like he knew you were coming." Suddenly, a loud metallic crash echoed outside the office. Everyone jumped. One of the guards grabbed his radio instantly. "He is moving toward the service corridor," a voice shouted through static. Daniel rushed toward the window overlooking the enclosure. Koba was gone from the glass barrier now. The giant silverback was moving rapidly through the habitat, ignoring food, toys, and even the other gorillas around him. His eyes were fixed on one thing only: the side security entrance connected to the staff hallway where Emily stood. Then Koba suddenly stopped moving entirely. Slowly, the enormous gorilla lowered himself beside the steel door leading directly toward the building. And for the first time all day, the sanctuary realized something terrifying. Koba was not trying to escape. He was waiting. The entire sanctuary remained on edge as Koba sat silently beside the steel service door, refusing to move even when handlers attempted to redirect him with food. The giant silverback simply ignored everything around him. His attention stayed fixed on the hallway behind the door, where Emily stood frozen beside Daniel and Sophie. "I have never seen him like this," Sophie admitted quietly while watching through the security monitor. "Usually when he gets emotional, he becomes unpredictable. But this," she shook her head slowly. "This feels different." Emily could not stop staring at the screen. Koba looked enormous sitting there beneath the dim overhead lights of the enclosure tunnel. Yet there was something strangely heartbreaking about him. His massive shoulders sagged slightly forward, and every few seconds he would glance toward the steel door as though afraid she might disappear again. Daniel crossed his arms tightly. "We should move her to another building until he calms down." Emily looked at him immediately. "No," Daniel frowned. "Emily, you do not understand how dangerous this situation could become." "No," she replied softly. "You do not understand him." For several seconds nobody spoke. Then suddenly one of the younger keepers entered the office looking pale. "Sir," he said nervously toward Daniel. "The transport committee just arrived." Daniel's expression immediately darkened. Emily noticed it instantly. "Transport committee?" she repeated. Sophie looked uncomfortable now. Daniel exhaled heavily before answering. "There is something we have not told you yet." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "What is going on?" Daniel walked toward the window overlooking the enclosure before finally speaking. The board voted last month to transfer Koba to a private containment facility in Nevada. Emily stared at him in disbelief. What? They believe he has become too unstable for public sanctuary care. Emily's face hardened immediately. You are sending him away because he is grieving? It is more complicated than that, Daniel replied carefully. Over the past 2 years, Koba stopped bonding with other gorillas completely. He isolates himself for days. Some handlers are afraid to enter the enclosure now. Emily looked back toward the security monitor where Koba still sat beside the steel door, waiting patiently. That is not aggression, she whispered. That is heartbreak. Sophie lowered her eyes slightly, saying nothing. A heavy silence filled the room before one of the radios suddenly crackled loudly. Security alert, a voice announced urgently. Koba is approaching the inner gate. Daniel immediately turned toward the monitor. Koba had risen to his feet. Slowly and deliberately, the silverback was walking deeper into the service corridor that connected directly to the indoor medical wing. How is he getting that far? One guard muttered nervously. Another keeper swallowed hard. Somebody left gate 3 unlocked. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Everyone moved back from the hallway now. Staff members hurried nervously through the building, while security guards rushed toward the corridor entrance carrying tranquilizer rifles. Emily felt panic spreading through the sanctuary around her, but strangely, she did not feel afraid. She kept watching the monitor as Koba moved carefully through the narrow passageway. Not running, not charging, looking, searching. Then suddenly the silverback stopped moving again. One of the cameras captured his face clearly for the first time in years. Emily's breath caught in her throat. There were tears in his eyes. Sophie stepped closer to the screen in shock. That is impossible, she whispered. Koba slowly reached one enormous hand toward the concrete floor beside the wall. For a second, nobody understood what he was doing. Then the gorilla carefully lifted something small from beneath a loose metal panel near the corner of the corridor. Daniel leaned closer toward the monitor. What is that? The camera zoomed slightly. Emily immediately covered her mouth in shock. Resting gently inside Koba's hand was an old photograph. Faded, bent at the corners, but still visible enough to recognize. It was a picture of Emily sitting beside baby Koba wrapped together in the same green blanket from years ago. The sanctuary fell completely silent. Then Koba looked directly into the nearest camera, tightened his grip around the photograph against his chest, and began walking straight toward the building where Emily stood. The closer Koba moved toward the building, the more the sanctuary spiraled into panic. Security alarms echoed through the hallways while handlers hurried to lock secondary gates throughout the facility. Several visitors were quietly escorted away from nearby observation areas, and nervous staff members gathered behind reinforced doors watching the security monitors with pale faces. But inside the control room, Emily could not take her eyes off the screen. Koba continued walking slowly through the corridor with the old photograph pressed tightly against his chest like something precious he had protected for years. He should not even remember that picture exists, Emily whispered shakily. Sophie looked at her carefully. How old was he when that photo was taken? Emily swallowed hard. Maybe 8 months old. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. Most people do not remember things from that age. Koba did, Emily answered quietly. On the monitor, the giant silverback finally reached the final security gate leading directly into the indoor medical wing. Thick reinforced steel separated him from the building, where Emily stood only 50 feet away. Koba stopped there silently. He stared through the narrow observation window built into the door, searching the hallway beyond it. Searching for her. Then he slowly sat down on the concrete floor and placed the photograph carefully beside him. The sight made several staff members visibly emotional. He has been waiting all these years, Sophie whispered softly. Daniel rubbed his forehead with one hand. Or he thinks she came back to take him away. The room fell quiet again. Emily looked down at the faded bracelet still wrapped around her wrist. She had almost forgotten she was wearing it. The same blue and yellow thread bracelet Koba used to hold whenever he got nervous as a baby. A memory suddenly resurfaced, so clearly it made her chest ache. Years earlier, after a severe thunderstorm knocked out power across the sanctuary, little Koba had refused to sleep unless Emily stayed beside him. All night long he clung to that bracelet while resting against her shoulder, terrified by every flash of lightning outside the cabin. Windows. Emily had promised him softly that she would never leave him alone. But she had. A sudden banging sound jolted everyone back to the present. Several staff members gasped as Koba placed one massive hand against the steel security gate, not striking it, touching it, slowly, carefully, almost gently. Then he let out a deep, low rumble that echoed through the hallway speakers. Emily froze instantly. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Tears suddenly filled Emily's eyes. "That sound," she whispered. "He only made that noise when he wanted comfort." Sophie looked stunned. "You understand his vocal patterns?" Emily nodded slowly without taking her eyes off the screen. "When he was scared as a baby, he used different sounds depending on what he needed. That one meant he wanted me close." The room became painfully quiet after that. For the first time all day, nobody spoke about danger. Nobody spoke about containment. They only watched the lonely silverback sitting beside the steel gate with an old photograph at his feet, waiting silently for the person he had lost 12 years earlier. Then suddenly another voice crackled through the radio system. "Transport team has arrived at the north entrance." Daniel's expression immediately tightened again. "Already?" One keeper muttered nervously. Emily turned sharply toward him. "You cannot move him today." Daniel looked conflicted now. "Emily, the paperwork was finalized weeks ago. Look at him," she said emotionally, pointing toward the monitor. "Does that look like an animal that needs punishment?" Before Daniel could respond, Koba suddenly stood upright again. Every person in the room froze instantly. The silverback picked up the photograph carefully and turned toward the camera mounted near the ceiling. His dark eyes locked directly onto the lens. Then slowly, unbelievably, he lifted the old photograph toward the glass as though trying to show it to someone. To Emily. Sophie covered her mouth in shock. One of the guards lowered his rifle completely. Even Daniel looked shaken now. Because in that moment, the entire sanctuary realized something none of them were prepared for. Koba was not acting like a dangerous animal. He was acting like someone terrified of losing his family again. The atmosphere inside the sanctuary shifted completely after Koba lifted the photograph toward the security camera. Moments earlier, staff members had been preparing for a containment emergency. Now many of them stood speechless, staring at the monitor with expressions of disbelief and guilt. Emily felt tears burning in her eyes as she watched the giant silverback hold onto the faded picture like it was the most important thing left in his world. Daniel finally broke the silence. If the transport team sees this behavior, they may classify it as emotional instability. Emily turned toward him sharply. "He is not unstable. He is grieving." Daniel looked exhausted. "You think I do not know that?" He lowered his voice. "I have worked with Koba for 9 years. I have seen him sit in the rain for hours holding that same photograph. I have seen him stop eating every anniversary of the day you left. But the board does not care about emotional trauma. They care about liability." Emily looked back at the monitor. Koba was still standing beside the gate, staring toward the hallway where he knew she was somewhere nearby. Every few seconds he glanced down at the photograph in his hand, as if reassuring himself it was real. Sophie stepped closer to Emily carefully. "There may still be one option." Daniel immediately looked at her. "Sophie, they deserve at least one supervised interaction before the transfer," she continued firmly. "We all know that." Daniel rubbed his jaw tensely. "If something goes wrong, the sanctuary could lose its license." "And if we do nothing?" Sophie replied softly. "We break him completely." Emily felt her chest tighten, hearing those words. Suddenly another low rumble echoed faintly through the hallway speakers. Everyone turned toward the monitor again. Koba had crouched beside the steel gate now, his enormous body curled inward protectively around the old photograph. Then something happened that none of the staff had ever witnessed before. The giant silverback slowly rested his forehead against the cold metal door and closed his eyes. Sophie covered her mouth emotionally. "He thinks she is leaving again," she whispered. Emily could not take it anymore. She stepped toward the hallway door immediately. Daniel grabbed her arm. "Emily, wait." She turned toward him with tears in her eyes. "When I rescued him, he was alone beside his mother for almost 2 days before we found him. He would not let anyone touch him at first. Not until I sat beside him and talked to him for hours." Her voice trembled slightly. "Do you know what finally made him stop shaking?" Daniel said nothing. I held his hand. Silence filled the room. Then suddenly a loud metallic alarm echoed through the building. One of the outer security gates had malfunctioned. Staff members rushed toward their radios in confusion. Gate 4 is opening, a guard shouted through static. Repeat, Gate 4 is partially open. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Which gate? The medical corridor access point. Emily's heart nearly stopped. The very corridor where Koba was waiting. Staff members hurried frantically toward the hallway while security guards raised their tranquilizer rifles again. But before anyone could react further, the monitor showed the steel gate sliding open nearly 12 inches due to the system failure. Every person in the control room froze. Koba lifted his head immediately. The silverback stared silently at the narrow opening. Then his eyes slowly shifted toward the hallway beyond it. Toward Emily. Daniel spoke carefully without looking away from the screen. Nobody moved. The sanctuary became deathly quiet. Koba stood up slowly, photograph still in his hand. One careful step at a time, the giant silverback approached the partially opened gate. Security guards tightened their grip on the rifles. Emily's breathing became shallow. Then Koba reached the opening and stopped completely. He did not force the gate wider. He did not roar. Instead, the enormous gorilla gently extended his hand through the narrow opening into the hallway beyond it. And resting in his palm was the old photograph of him and Emily together. No one in the hallway dared to breathe as Koba kept his enormous hand extended through the partially opened gate. The old photograph rested gently in his palm, worn from years of being held and protected. Emily stared at it through tears, barely able to process what she was seeing. 12 years had passed. 12 years without hearing her voice, without seeing her face, without understanding why she disappeared from his life. Yet somehow Koba had held on to that single memory the entire time. One of the security guards slowly lowered his tranquilizer rifle. "He is giving it back to her," he whispered in disbelief. Daniel remained tense beside the wall, his eyes fixed on every movement Koba made. "Nobody opens that gate any further," he warned quietly. But Emily was no longer listening. Her eyes remained locked on the giant silverback waiting silently on the other side of the steel barrier. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer to the opening. Several staff members immediately became nervous again. "Emily," Sophie said softly, "be careful." Koba did not move. He simply watched her approach with an expression that no one inside the sanctuary had ever seen before. The fear was gone from his face now. So was the panic. What remained looked almost like hope. Emily stopped inches from the opening in the gate. Her hands trembled as she slowly reached toward the photograph resting in Koba's palm. The second her fingers touched the edge of the picture, the enormous gorilla let out a deep emotional rumble that vibrated through the entire hallway. Emily instantly froze. Tears rolled down her face. "I know," she whispered softly. "I missed you too." Koba lowered his head slightly the moment he heard her voice. The giant silverback closed his eyes for a brief second as though finally hearing something he had waited years to hear again. Then, unbelievably, he moved even closer to the gate opening. Security guards immediately stiffened. Daniel stepped forward carefully. Emily stepped back now. But before she could move, Koba slowly pushed something else through the narrow opening beside the photograph. At first no one understood what it was. Then Sophie gasped quietly. It was the blue and yellow bracelet Emily still wore on her wrist. Or at least another version of it. A second bracelet. Older. Frayed from time. Emily covered her mouth in shock. "No," she whispered emotionally. Memories came flooding back instantly. Years ago, when Koba was still small enough to sit in her lap, Emily used to braid pieces of colored thread together during long rainy afternoons at the sanctuary. One day she had tied one bracelet around her wrist and another loosely around Koba's arm while joking that they matched. She had completely forgotten about it after leaving Africa. But Koba had not. The giant silverback carefully nudged the old bracelet closer to her through the opening. Emily could barely breathe now. "He kept it all this time," Sophie whispered behind her. Koba suddenly made another soft rumbling sound and slowly leaned his forehead against the edge of the steel gate beside Emily. Not forcing through it. Not trying to escape. Just trying to be close to her again. Emily closed her eyes for a moment as tears continued falling down her cheeks. Then carefully, very slowly, she placed her hand against the side of Koba's face through the narrow opening. The entire sanctuary froze. Security guards looked ready to react at any second. But Koba did not become aggressive. The instant Emily touched him, the giant silverback released a broken sound that almost resembled crying. His entire body trembled again. Sophie covered her eyes emotionally. Even Daniel looked shaken now, because after years of fear, isolation, and emotional collapse, the most dangerous gorilla in the sanctuary was not reacting like a wild animal at all. He was reacting like someone who had finally found the person he loved most in the world. And then Koba did something that left everyone completely speechless. Very gently, the giant silverback took Emily's hand in both of his and refused to let go. The hallway remained completely silent as Koba held Emily's hand between his enormous palms. No one inside the sanctuary had ever witnessed the silverback behave this way. The gorilla that staff members once described as emotionally unreachable now looked terrified of losing contact with her for even a second. Emily gently stroked the side of his hand with her thumb while tears continued running down her face. "I am here," she whispered. Softly. "I am not leaving right now." The effect those words had on Koba was immediate. The giant silverback released another deep, trembling rumble and slowly lowered himself onto the floor beside the gate while still holding her hand carefully. Sophie wiped tears from her eyes as she watched from several feet away. "I cannot believe this," she whispered. Daniel remained silent, but his entire expression had changed. The fear he carried earlier was gone now. In its place was guilt. Years of misunderstanding suddenly seemed to crash down on everyone in the hallway at once. Koba had never been acting out because he was dangerous. He had been grieving. Emily slowly crouched beside the opening in the gate so she could be closer to him. Koba immediately leaned forward until his forehead rested near her shoulder through the narrow space. The giant silverback closed his eyes again, visibly calmer now than at any point that day. "He trusts her completely," one of the guards muttered quietly. Then something unexpected happened. Koba suddenly released Emily's hand and stood up again. Several staff members stiffened nervously, but the silverback did not move aggressively. Instead, he looked down the hallway behind him and made a soft, low sound toward Emily, as if asking her to follow. Emily frowned slightly. "What is he doing?" Sophie asked. Emily watched Koba carefully for a moment before answering. "He wants to show me something." Daniel immediately shook his head. "Absolutely not." But before anyone could argue further, Koba walked several feet back down the corridor, then stopped and looked over his shoulder toward Emily again. He repeated the same low rumbling sound. "Waiting." Emily slowly stood up. "That is exactly what he used to do when he wanted me to follow him somewhere." Daniel looked deeply conflicted now. "Emily, if we open that gate fully and something happens, nothing is going to happen," she interrupted softly. "Look at him." Everyone turned back toward Koba. The massive silverback was sitting patiently in the middle of the corridor with the old photograph still clutched carefully in one hand. Not threatening anyone, not trying to escape, just waiting for her. Sophie finally stepped beside Daniel quietly. "I think she is right." Daniel stared at the scene for several long seconds before finally exhaling heavily. "Open the secondary barrier," he ordered reluctantly. Several staff members exchanged nervous looks. "Sir." "Do it slowly," Daniel repeated, "and keep emergency teams ready." A loud mechanical buzz echoed through the hallway as the inner security gate slowly began sliding open. Every person present held their breath. Emily stepped forward carefully while Koba watched her with complete focus. The moment the opening became wide enough, the giant silverback immediately moved toward her. Several guards instinctively reached for their rifles again. But instead of charging past her or trying to flee, Koba stopped directly in front of Emily and gently touched the side of her arm, like he still could not believe she was real. Emily placed both hands carefully against his shoulders. Koba closed his eyes instantly. The giant silverback leaned his full weight downward slightly, almost like a child finally finding safety after years of fear. Then, without warning, Koba turned and began walking deeper down the corridor again. Every few feet, he glanced back to make sure Emily was following him. Finally, he stopped beside a loose metal panel near the wall and pulled it open carefully with one hand. Emily stepped closer and gasped softly. Hidden inside the small compartment was an entire collection of memories. Old blankets, broken toys from the nursery, weathered photographs, the cassette tape, even one of Emily's old sanctuary jackets folded carefully beneath everything else. For 12 years, Koba had protected every single reminder he had left of her. The hallway filled with stunned silence as Emily slowly knelt beside the hidden compartment of memories Koba had protected for more than a decade. Her trembling hands moved carefully across the old blanket, the faded nursery toys, and the stack of weathered photographs curled from age and humidity. Every object carried a piece of the life they once shared together. Koba sat quietly beside her the entire time, watching her face with deep focus as though waiting for her. Reaction mattered more than anything else in the world. Emily picked up the old sanctuary jacket from the compartment and immediately recognized the torn sleeve near the shoulder. She laughed softly through tears. "You used to sleep with this every night," she whispered toward Koba. The giant silverback released a low rumbling sound and gently rested one hand against the jacket in her lap. Sophie stood nearby, wiping tears from her face openly now. "All these years," she said quietly, "we thought he was becoming emotionally unstable because he hated people." Daniel stared at Koba silently for several long seconds before finally shaking his head. "He was never angry," he admitted softly. "He was heartbroken." Emily looked toward him carefully. "Animals do not stop loving someone just because time passes." Koba suddenly leaned closer and nudged the old cassette tape toward Emily with surprising gentleness. She frowned slightly before picking it up. The label was faded, but she immediately recognized her own handwriting. "Bedtime songs for Koba." Emily covered her mouth emotionally. "I made this for him when he was sick," she whispered. Sophie looked stunned. "He kept everything." Daniel slowly removed the radio from his belt and turned it off completely. Around the sanctuary, the tension that had consumed the day finally began fading away. No alarms, no shouting, no fear. Only the quiet sound of the giant silverback sitting peacefully beside the woman he had waited 12 years to see again. Several minutes later, one of the security guards stepped nervously into the hallway. "Sir," he said softly toward Daniel, "the transport committee is asking for an update." Daniel looked toward Koba sitting beside Emily. Then he looked back at the guard. "Tell them the transfer is postponed indefinitely." The guard blinked in surprise. "Sir." Daniel did not hesitate this time. "That gorilla does not need isolation," he said firmly. "He needs healing." Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed with relief. Beside her, Koba gently rested his enormous head against her shoulder again, calmer now than anyone at the sanctuary had seen in years. Sophie smiled softly through tears. His heart never moved on. Hours passed quietly inside the enclosure corridor while Emily sat beside Koba telling him stories in a soft voice, just like she had when he was small. And every time she spoke, the giant silverback listened carefully as though afraid to miss even a single word. By sunset, the entire sanctuary had